He wasn't on the guest list. He didn't wear a suit, but 6 men in the fifth row couldn't stop watching him because 20 years ago, he flew them out of hell. The sun had just begun to lift the morning mist off the red-bricked campus of Arlington Crest Academy when Margaret Chen pulled into the South faculty lot. Graduation morning. You could feel it in the crisp air, in the way parents rushed across the quad in uncomfortable shoes and too bright dresses, clutching programs and phones and flowers. There was always something sacred about mornings like this. She thought not sacred in the religious sense, but sacred like something you didn't want to ruin with noise. Margaret stepped out of her car, adjusted her cardigan, and tucked her staff badge behind her ID lanyard. She wasn't planning to stay long, just long enough to support a few students she'd mentored, but something in the air made her linger a moment before entering the main hall. That's when she saw him. He didn't come in through the front gates like the others. He entered from the side path near the maintenance shed, slow, steady steps. Not like someone late, but like someone who was exactly where he meant to be. He wore a faded leather flight jacket, scuffed at the seams and creased at the elbows, over a collared shirt that had clearly seen better decades. His boots were military, though softened now by time and pavement. In his hands was a rolled-up cloth bundle, tightly wrapped, pressed against his chest like something precious. The rest of the crowd moved past him, barely noticing. But Margaret noticed, not because he made a scene, but precisely because he didn't. He was still unnaturally still in a morning full of motion. His eyes scanned the auditorium quietly, not searching, just watching. He walked with purpose toward the front rows, where silver placards marked honored guests and family of graduates. He reached the velvet rope and paused. A young woman with a clipboard intercepted him. "Sir, this section is for immediate family only," she said, politely but without hesitation. The man didn't flinch. He nodded once, calm. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded note. He didn't unfold it. He didn't read it aloud. He just held it out. "My granddaughter asked me to be here," he said, voice low, not defensive. The girl didn't read it. She just glanced at the badge hanging from his neck, which wasn't there, and pointed down the aisle. "I'm sorry, sir. You'll need to find seating toward the back." Margaret's brow furrowed. The man didn't protest. He didn't argue. He simply stepped back one pace, maybe two, and moved to stand along the sidewall beneath the glowing red exit sign. Hands behind his back, eyes forward, no sigh, no slouch, just patience. The crowd kept streaming in. Margaret took her seat in the fifth row, but she found herself turning again and again, not toward the stage, not toward the graduates, but toward the man who didn't belong, and yet somehow seemed to anchor the whole room in silence. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The program crinkled softly in Margaret's lap as she settled into her seat, fifth row, center left, a vantage point she appreciated not just for the view of the stage, but for the way it framed the audience. She always believed people told more of the story than speeches ever did. And right now, the man by the exit sign was telling a story no one else seemed to notice. He hadn't moved since being turned away. Still standing, still composed, still holding the folded cloth bundle tight against his chest. Margaret leaned slightly to her left to get a better view. She couldn't explain it, but something about the way he stood, the weight in his posture, made her feel like he wasn't just waiting for someone to walk the stage. He was waiting for the world to remember something it had forgotten. Then, movement. The girl with the headset reappeared, this time accompanied by a second staffer, both glancing toward the back wall with discomfort just barely masked by professionalism. Margaret heard the whisper as they passed. "He's still there. I checked. No registration, no badge, nothing official. Well, keep security nearby. If he makes a scene, he won't," Margaret thought, not sure why she felt so sure. "He's not the kind who makes scenes. He's the kind scenes happen around." She looked back toward the man. He hadn't noticed the conversation. Or maybe he had, but didn't care. His eyes were locked on the stage with quiet precision, like he was measuring the distance between where he stood and where he was meant to be. And then, gently, deliberately, he reached into the inner lining of his jacket. A small square of yellowed paper emerged, a handwritten note, edges worn, fold lines softened by repetition. He unfolded it carefully, as if it were a relic. Margaret leaned forward ever so slightly. In looping, imperfect script, the kind only teenagers or the deeply sincere write, it read, "Grandpa, please sit in the front row. It would mean everything. Love, Emma." He read it once, then folded it again and tucked it back close to his heart, just beneath the worn leather of his jacket. And yet, no one came for him. No usher offered an exception. No seat was unreserved in his name. Instead, a uniformed security guard began making his way down the side aisle, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. Margaret felt her pulse tighten. The man saw the guard approaching and turned to face him, not aggressively, but with the same grounded stillness he'd held since he entered. There was a brief exchange, hushed, but clear enough for the tone to carry. The guard gestured toward the back. The man shook his head once, calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I just want to see my granddaughter walk that stage." The guard didn't respond, just stood a little taller. Margaret's hand curled unconsciously around the edge of her program. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing already: they were about to make a mistake. The ceremony began in the usual way, a booming welcome over the speakers. Polite applause rising like a wave and falling just as quickly. Cameras clicked. Flashes popped. The band struck a familiar chord, and students began filing in caps tilted just so, gowns rustling with each careful step. Margaret clapped, but her eyes weren't on the graduates. They were still on the man by the wall. He hadn't moved, not an inch. His hands now rested behind his back, fingers interlaced, chin slightly raised, not proud, not expectant, but steady. The note, she imagined, was still tucked safely inside that old jacket, its words closer to his chest than any metal. The security guard had returned to his position near the back doors. No one had escorted him out, not yet, but he was watching, and so were others. Margaret turned subtly to her right row 5, center left, and noticed a small group of men seated just a few chairs over. 6 of them, late 40s, early 50s maybe, civilian clothes but sharp posture, clean-cut hair, quiet eyes. Not one of them had looked at the stage. They were watching the man by the wall, not just watching, recognizing. Margaret wasn't sure how she knew, but something in the way their gazes held alert, deliberate, heavy with memory, told her these weren't casual observers. These were men who had seen things, men who had followed someone before, and that someone was standing beneath a glowing red exit sign in a room that had no idea who he was. Then the dean's son, the student speaker, stepped up to the microphone. Tall, polished, confident in a way that invited both admiration and slight envy. He launched into his remarks with practiced ease. Thanks to faculty, applause. Thanks to parents, more applause. A joke about tuition, laughter. Then he said it. And of course, thanks to the beautiful, well-documented families in the front row for reminding us what real support looks like. There was a polite chuckle, the kind that trickled through a room like carbonation, forced, fizzy, empty. Margaret didn't laugh. Neither did the 6 men in row 5. One of them, broad-shouldered, a crease still visible where a ball cap had been recently removed, leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the man by the wall. "That was for him," he murmured, voice low, as if confirming something already understood. The others didn't speak. They just nodded, once, in unison. And that was when Margaret felt it, not outrage exactly, and not pity, something quieter, a hollowing in the chest, a sense that something unjust had been served with a smile. And most of the room had swallowed it whole, but not everyone. Some saw, some knew, and in that growing silence beneath the applause, she realized something was building. Not loud, not yet, but soon. The applause faded, but the temperature in the room had shifted subtly, like a breeze slipping in through a cracked window. Margaret could feel it. So could the 6 men in row 5. And she suspected, though he didn't show it, the man at the wall felt it too. He remained still, still as he had been for the past 30 minutes. But something had changed. Maybe it was the way the crowd was beginning to lean forward, shifting their weight, no longer just celebrating, but searching, scanning the rows for someone important, someone introduced, someone visible. And when they couldn't find that person, they simply looked back to the stage, as if that made the confusion disappear. They never looked at him. The girl in the headset passed again, whispering now to a third staff member. Margaret caught a few words still there. Doesn't belong, handle it quietly. Her gut tightened. Down the side aisle, the security guard returned clipboard in one hand, radio in the other. He approached the man carefully, like he was trying not to draw attention, but couldn't help creating tension with each footstep. Margaret leaned forward in her seat. The man didn't react until the guard spoke, voice soft but firm. Sir, we've asked you to remain in the general seating area. I'll need you to come with me. The man turned his head slightly, not startled, not defensive, just aware. I'm not causing trouble, he said again, voice low but clear. I'm not leaving until I see her walk. He didn't say her name, but Margaret knew who he meant. The girl who'd written the note, the one who'd asked for him in the front row. The guard stood taller, as if height might replace authority. Margaret's heart beat faster. She turned to the woman seated next to her, older, dressed sharply, wearing a faculty badge. Margaret whispered, Do you know who that man is? The woman didn't look up from her program. Probably wandered in. Happens every year. We get extras. Extras. The word caught in Margaret's throat, like he was scenery, like he was clutter. She looked back. And this time, she really saw him. The creases in his face, the way his left shoulder hung slightly lower, not from fatigue, but from some long-healed injury that never really healed. The jacket wasn't for effect, it was the best he had. The boots worn, but shined like they'd once walked places no one asked about anymore. He hadn't come to make a statement. He'd come to keep a promise. But promises, in rooms like these, didn't always hold weight. The guard shifted. Another staffer approached. One hand hovered near the man's elbow. Not grabbing, not forcing, just ready. That's when he reached into his jacket again. Slow, intentional, and drew out the note. Margaret watched the paper unfold like a flag no one had saluted. Grandpa, please sit in the front row. It would mean everything. The usher didn't read it, just shook her head. No guest pass, no seat. And the man nodded. Not defeated, just steady. Margaret felt heat rise behind her eyes. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about what the room was refusing to see. It began with a sound barely audible over the hum of the auditorium, the sharp scrape of a chair leg pulling back from polished wood. Margaret turned her head instinctively. One of the men in row 5 had stood up. Broad shoulders, civilian clothes, baseball cap tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket. His eyes were trained on the man by the wall. A moment later, another chair moved, then 2 more, and then all 6 men were on their feet. No one else noticed yet, not the dean, not the speakers, not the sea of families still fiddling with their cameras and bouquets. But Margaret noticed. She noticed everything now. The first man stepped out into the aisle, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had long since learned the value of walking instead of running. He didn't approach the stage. He didn't approach the staff. He walked straight toward the back, toward the man by the wall. The security guard shifted, uncertain. Margaret leaned forward slightly, heart caught between beats. The man from row 5 reached into his coat. For a second, a tense, electric second, Margaret didn't know what he was pulling out. But then she saw it. A coin-sized object, round and gleaming beneath the overhead lights. He held it out, not high, not showy, just enough for it to catch the eye. The emblem etched in gold and silver twin wings. A dagger, and a lightning bolt, the unmistakable insignia of a U.S. Air Commando unit. And that's when the auditorium changed. Not loudly, but definitively. The man spoke, voice low but clear, like gravel laced with steel. That man doesn't leave this room. The guard stiffened. He flew us through fire when there was no one else in the sky. When the radios cut out, when the storm rolled in, he didn't wait for clearance. He just came. Another man from the group stepped forward now, pulling out a matching insignia. Then another. All six, standing behind the man who had been pushed aside. Not in front of him, not shielding him, just behind him, like they had once flown. Margaret's throat tightened. The staffer who had dismissed the old man earlier stepped back now, her eyes wide and unsure. She didn't say a word. Neither did the guard. The auditorium began to shift, not physically, but in atmosphere. You could feel it, the slow, quiet turning of attention. Phones lowered. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A stillness, reverent and unscripted, began to bloom. And the one who had simply wanted a seat, remained exactly where he'd been all along. He didn't step forward. He didn't lift his head. He just stood. Not for recognition, not for honor, but because someone, maybe six someones, had finally stood with him. And in that moment, the room was no longer his enemy. It was just late to understand. The silence that followed wasn't sudden. It unfolded like a slow breath held across hundreds of lungs as eyes began to turn and shoulders began to shift, rippling outward from the back corner of the auditorium where six men now stood, quiet and resolute, behind the one they refused to let be removed. And still, he hadn't moved. The man in the flight jacket, Harrison Ford, stood with his hands calmly behind his back, gaze forward, not proud, not humbled, but somewhere in the unshakable stillness between. Margaret glanced at the podium. The speaker faltered now, his voice thinning against the growing awareness in the room. A moment ago, he'd had the spotlight to himself. Now, that spotlight was drifting not in beam or bulb, but in presence. Then, from the edge of the faculty section, a figure stood, gray suit, white gloves folded in one hand, medals pinned across a formal jacket whose buttons shone like brass in morning light. A tall man, upright, steady. A murmur moved through the closest rows. Margaret recognized the insignia, retired UNS Air Force Colonel. He stepped into the aisle. No rush, just purpose. And when he spoke, he didn't raise his voice, but the weight of it cut through the air like a blade through still water. I know that man. Heads turned now, fully, deliberately. His name is Harrison Ford, captain, rescue pilot, U.S. Air Force, retired, served 2 decades. The kind of man who flew into the worst of it when everyone else was told to wait. A pause. In 1999, we lost an entire comms unit in the Hindu Kush. Sandstorm rolling in, nightfall coming fast, no backup, no radio. We had men down. Everyone said the LZ was too hot to reach. Everyone but him. His voice cracked, but only once. He flew through a blackout sky, blind but not afraid. Picked up every last man. I watched him carry wounded strangers into his chopper like they were his own sons. Didn't speak, didn't stay, just got them home. The auditorium stilled. The applause hadn't come, not yet, because no one seemed quite sure what to do with what they were hearing. But Margaret didn't need a program or medal count. She saw it now in every line on Harrison's face. The way his body tilted slightly left, like he still bore the weight of what he carried decades ago. The way he still stood like the mission hadn't ended. The colonel stepped back, and for a moment, no one spoke. Not because they couldn't, but because they shouldn't. It wasn't a moment that needed narration. It was one that demanded silence. Margaret sat, breath caught, and beside her, others were doing the same, not applauding, not whispering, just listening. And at the center of it, the man they'd almost forgotten remained still. Not because he was waiting for permission, but because, finally, the room had remembered who he was. The stillness hadn't broken. The colonel had sat back down, metals catching the overhead light like echoes from another time. The crowd remained suspended in something quieter than awe, something like reverence, or perhaps a late-arriving apology no one knew how to speak aloud. Then Margaret heard it, the shuffle of a gown, movement near the back of the graduate section. A young woman had risen from her chair, her cap slightly askew, gold honors cord swaying with each careful step. She wasn't walking toward the podium. She was walking past it, eyes wide, breath measured, determined. Margaret recognized her from the program. Emma Ford, biology, top of her class. She didn't clear her throat, didn't ask for permission. She just stepped to the microphone, fingers trembling slightly as they adjusted the height. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but somehow everyone heard it. "That's my grandfather." Gas didn't ripple through the audience, not the dramatic kind. What moved through the crowd instead was a stillness that drew closer, like the room itself was leaning in. He never asked to be seated in the front row. He didn't even ask to be acknowledged. He just wanted to be here. For me, she paused. No one spoke. No one dared. Every morning before school, since I was old enough to remember, he would pack my lunch, hand me my backpack, and say one thing: stand tall. Be the kind of person you'd be proud to meet. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't stop. I got this far because of him, because of who he is. And I'm not proud because of this degree. I'm proud because that man standing at the back of this room is mine. She didn't wait for applause. There was none. Only the sound of her footsteps as she descended the stage and walked not hesitantly, not theatrically directly toward the exit sign, toward him, toward her grandfather. When she reached him, she stopped. And for a moment, the old pilot looked unsure, like maybe he didn't want to embarrass her, didn't want to make her moment about him. But Emma didn't hesitate. She raised her hand slow, deliberate, and saluted. And that was what broke it. The hush, the invisible veil between public ceremony and private truth. Harrison didn't return the salute. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't posed for photos. It was real, quiet, earned. And for the first time all morning, Margaret felt something shift in her chest, something bigger than recognition. It was restoration, not just for him, but for everyone watching who'd ever been asked to stand in the back when they'd carried the weight of the front. The embrace between Emma and her grandfather didn't last long. It didn't need to. It wasn't the kind of moment that tried to stretch itself. It just existed full, true, and unspoken. And when they stepped apart, there was no applause, no music, only the sound of realization settling across the auditorium like dust that had always been there, only now everyone could see it. Emma turned, her hand still lightly on her grandfather's arm. She didn't need to say anything more. She had already said everything that mattered. And somehow, in her stillness, the room shifted again, this time, not in silence, but in motion. One by one, people began to stand. Not because anyone told them to, not because they were cued by music or prompted by tradition. They stood because something inside them insisted it was the only right thing to do. Margaret felt herself rise without even realizing her knees had bent. Around her, rows of families did the same. Slowly, quietly, deliberately. No whoops, no clapping. Just the sound of chairs being pushed gently back and the kind of reverent breath people take when they're in the presence of something greater than themselves. In the corner, the 6 air commandos straightened their posture. Still behind him, still silent, but now, no longer unnoticed. Their presence had changed everything, not by demand, but by example. And still, Harrison Ford didn't move. He didn't soak in the moment. He didn't nod in triumph. He just stood, his granddaughter by his side, that same folded note tucked safely inside the inner pocket of his jacket. Margaret found her eyes drawn to him again. She tried to find the words to describe what she was seeing, but none came close. It wasn't dignity. It wasn't humility. It was something older, deeper, the kind of quiet a man earns when he no longer needs to explain who he is. He didn't come here for a stage. He came for a promise, a seat, but the seat had never really been the point. Now the entire room was on its feet, and in their silence was something louder than applause acknowledgement. Not the loud kind, not the public kind, but the kind that says, "We saw you too late, but we see you now." The usher who'd blocked him earlier still stood by the aisle, frozen, her clipboard trembling in her hands. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no sound came. And Harrison, still not looking at her, reached into his coat and unfolded the note one more time. He read it to himself, lips unmoving. "Grandpa, please sit in the front row. It would mean everything." He folded it again, slid it back over his heart, and only then did he take his first step forward. Not because he was finally allowed, but because, at last, the way had been cleared not by authority, by truth. Harrison's first step echoed more than it should have. Not loud, just clear. The hush in the auditorium held, unbroken and total, like the very air had chosen not to move until he did. It was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around a moment, sealing it into memory before it was even finished. He didn't walk fast. There was no urgency in his stride, just rhythm, slow, measured, exact, like every step had weight, not just from his boots, but from all the miles they had carried him before this. Emma walked beside him, eyes forward, her cap wobbling gently with each pace. Her hand remained just behind his back, not guiding him, she didn't have to, but there, as if to say, "You're not doing this alone anymore." And no one stopped them. Not the ushers, not the faculty, not even the clipboard still gripped by the woman who had turned him away just an hour before. She stood off to the side now, spine stiff, eyes lowered as if the gravity of her earlier mistake had settled into her hands, trembling against paper that suddenly felt heavier than it was. Harrison never looked at her. He didn't need to. That, Margaret thought, was the real power of restraint. It didn't just speak louder than retaliation. It disarmed it. As they neared the roped-off section, people stepped back without being asked. A path opened, quietly, gracefully. The very row that had once been barred to him now welcomed him without a word. He reached the second row, center left, a seat labeled reserved. Someone had removed the placard. Margaret couldn't tell who. He paused beside it. Then, slowly, carefully, he lowered himself into the chair. No flourish, no adjustment, just presence. Emma sat beside him, smoothing her gown as she exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Behind them, the 6 air commandos remained standing, arms relaxed at their sides, expressions unreadable but unshakable. They didn't return to their seats. They didn't need to. Their place had always been behind him. Margaret looked around. Dozens still stood, some with hands folded, some with eyes glassy, blinking too often. The applause hadn't come, not yet, but its absence was not silence. It was reverence. The dean, returning to the podium, hesitated for a full 2 beats before speaking. His voice had changed, thinner now, less certain. He cleared his throat, tried to find footing. "We are honored," he began, "to welcome guests of distinction. Some we failed to recognize soon enough. There were a few claps, then more, but none of it, Margaret knew, was for him. It wasn't for the school, not even for the graduates. It was for a man who had been denied a chair and instead earned the room. The ceremony carried on. Names were called, degrees were handed out, cameras flashed again, but the rhythm had changed, softened somehow. Less about spectacle, more about meaning. No one said it aloud, but the auditorium wasn't watching the stage anymore. They were watching him. Harrison Ford sat quietly in the second row, hands resting on his knees, the note still folded in his jacket. He didn't shift. He didn't fidget. He simply watched the way only someone who had once flown through storms could watch, with full presence and none of the need for praise. Emma's name was called. She stood, walked the aisle, took her diploma. Her smile was quiet, small, but deep. She didn't turn to wave. She didn't need to. She walked straight back and sat beside her grandfather again, brushing her gown as she lowered herself gently into the seat. That was when it started. One student, tall and freckled, paused at the edge of the row after crossing the stage. He turned slightly toward Harrison and extended his hand. No words, just a brief shake. Then he moved on. Then another. A girl with tear-streaked cheeks stopped, looked at Emma, then at Harrison, and placed her hand gently on his shoulder before moving past. A line began to form. Some offered salutes. Some simply nodded. One young woman no older than 20 stepped close, whispered, "Thank you for flying when no one else would," then walked away without waiting for acknowledgement. Margaret watched, frozen in her seat. There were no microphones here, no cameras, no curated headlines. Just a long, slow procession of gratitude, unfiltered, raw, real. Then one of the 6 men stepped forward, the youngest looking of them. Light stubble, calloused hands. He placed something in Harrison's palm and stepped back. A coin. Challenge coin. Margaret had only seen one once before at a funeral. Harrison turned it over gently in his hand. On one side, the insignia of the rescue unit. On the other, 5 engraved words. "The quiet ones fly the loudest storms." He didn't cry, but Margaret swore just for a second that his shoulders lowered, as if a weight had been lifted. Not removed, just shared. The crowd began to file out. Families gathered for pictures. Balloons floated. Laughter returned, but softer now, calmer. Margaret didn't move. She watched as Harrison stood slowly, Emma beside him, and made his way toward the doors. No one blocked his path. No one looked away. They just parted, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of something harder to earn respect. At the threshold, Harrison paused. He didn't turn around. He didn't wave. But Margaret saw the way Emma looked at him, like you look at a lighthouse that's always been there, even when the world forgot it. And in that moment, she understood he didn't come to be seen, but by the time he left, we couldn't look away. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.